Now, there's a big issue that's playing out in Nigeria over a new law in Rivers State that allows the government of Governor Nyesom Wike to collect value-added tax or VAT. It's an extraordinary development, something that could fundamentally disrupt and reshape fiscal and political arrangements in Nigeria. According to one analysis, it's not so much about the expected earnings from the tax itself, but rather about how other states might respond to it. And that's because potentially the new law has brought back the debate about restructuring in Nigeria, something that's been discussed for many years in this country without resolution. But now comes a possible opportunity for states to start the process of becoming more independent of the central federal government. The FIRS, though, is sticking to its guns.
The revenue arising from VAT is shared among the three tiers of government based on the extant provisions. And currently, 35% goes to the local governments, 50% goes to the state governments, while 15% goes to the federal government. And so, in actual effect, 85% of VAT collected goes to states and local governments, while only 15% goes to the federal government. FRS indeed had approached the appellate court to review the judgment at the lower court, at the Federal Court of Appeal in Rivers. And I think I'll just leave it at that. So be assured that FRS has filed an appeal, and that one is in process, and that is why we are not able to speak.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the lawyer and Arise News analyst, Dr. Sam Amadi. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Just tell us more about the arguments over the collection of value-added tax, or VAT. Is it essentially a fight over whether the tax should be collected locally or federally?
I think primarily that's what it is. I mean, the question around allocation, who gets what share, is a subsidiary question. The real question is who has competence. Taxation goes with legislative competence. You know, the basic work that legislators do is appropriation, which is for our own economy that is resource-based, oil. We don't seem to understand that actually the real kernel of appropriation is taxation. How does the government raise money? So we raise bulk of our money from oil and oil services and oil productions, oil products. But here, the question is around which of the sovereigns, if you like, the nation or sub-nation, has the right to tax. Okay, the constitution, the second schedule talk about, in item 50, I think, talks about income tax, corporate tax, all those taxes, even export tax. These are exclusive to federal government. Now, of course, we know that there are also even cow tax, there are store tax across the country, where they handle it at the level of local government. The question is around VAT, which is a consumption tax. So the argument of Rivers State government is, look, this is a tax that falls within the legislative competence of the state. And therefore, it's the state government that has capacity to tax on those issues. Now, the federal argument is, the argument I have from the FRS is that, look, ultimately, this tax goes to the states. We share it to the states. Now, the problem with that argument is around sharing. The first question is, who has the right to tax? Who should tax people? And so under federation, taxing powers are shared. So federal government has some level of power to tax. If you look at income tax, some people pay income to states, some pay for federal government. States like Florida, for example, basically rely on tourism tax. It's the state that does that tax. So you would argue public finance first and then law is that the Constitution says the state government, it seems from the Constitution, has exclusive right to tax for consumption, VAT. The federal government should not tax. That's what the court says. Now, this order is declaratory. It didn't bring an order to say stop IFRS or anything, just declare the right. And so based on the declaration, the state government has now gone ahead to do that. And Lagos is coming up with legislation. So the primary argument is who should tax?
So really this is potentially a constitutional matter.
It
I
is
mean,
primary.
because the issue of who's got jurisdiction over the collection of taxes, that's the big deal. And a lot of other financial issues would then fall under that. Does it seem likely that it's going to end up in the Supreme Court as a major, because I mean, the FIRS are saying that they've appealed against this ruling.
Yeah. I think it will go to the Supreme Court, probably driven more by the politics of it, the politics than the legality. For lawyers, tax lawyers and constitutional lawyers, it could be, someone can argue that it's open and close. If it's not an item, the constitutional design of power is that no power is implied. Every power is expressly conferred by the Constitution,
Absolutely.
not implied. So if the constitutional division of power between the federal and the state has such that it has been so clearly articulated, whatever the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction, the state can't do anything. What they have concurrent, the states and federal can do. And when the federal is first to step in, it trumps the state. But what is reserved for the state is primarily state responsibility. So in that case, it could be open and closed. But because of the politics, this is almost existential in terms of a state as Nigerian state as an organism. It's like a cancer. You have to do a major surgery. There will be blood will be out. People will suffer. This will happen. So that will drive it to Supreme Court. Now, we could say, so once you get to Supreme Court, policy, politics, strategic arguments may come in, and how it ends might be slightly indeterminate. But on paper, as it is right now, I think the state government, River State, has a very strong argument in terms of the constitutionality and the legality of it.
Right, but the head of the FIRS, I mean, we heard a brief clip from him there, says no country in the world collects tax at the state level. So really there is no global precedent. Not that that should affect the way that Nigeria makes its decisions, but you know, he makes that argument that this would be a pretty exceptional move in Nigeria. And if you look at the argument of the states, though, it has to do with not so much the legality of it, but also the fairness of it. That, I mean, this distribution of VAT tax to all the state governments and so on, and local governments, that they collected more than 15 billion naira in taxes, and they only got paid 4 billion, just over 4 billion.
And that's also, the constitutional questions are basically contextual, depending on what constitutions are designed, evolve to respond to issues. So the constitutional design in the US and Nigeria will not be the same. Now in the US, states have more responsibility, more power. So the question here in Nigeria will be clear. What should state get? Why should you distribute it, on what basis? Now, if you look at how we distribute revenue in Nigeria, is population, something not credible figures anyway, landmass, and so those indicators. None of them, aligns to production, to effort by states to create the economy that sustains consumption. Now, VAT tax is a special kind of tax that is built around governance. So people live in a city, they're tourists, or they spend more because they're able to generate more resources, and because the environment is conducive for production. And those taxes, take for example, places like Owerri, for example, where people talk about tourism, maybe hotels, okay? So people go and stay in hotels and spend their time, conferences, because perhaps somebody is managing the ecotourism, somebody is dealing with security issues, somebody with governance issues, and that creates an impetus, a flow towards more tourism activities, okay? That tax is now put together and shared according to indicators that are not in any way tied to who is doing what. So that's
Absolutely.
the question of fairness. But the other question of incentive is, why would we be talking about states being appendages, not being functionally productive? States are basically coming to Abuja to collect, and at the same time, one low-hanging fruit, which is VAT, that states can be incentivized to expand that pool of resources for themselves, is now to be federalized. So I think from a public policy
it's been there for a while.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for a public policy point of view, that's a wrong incentive structure. It means that the constitutional framework or the legal framework undermines
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah. But from the point of view of the FIRS, whose job is not to make the kind of decisions that you're talking about. I mean, their job is simply to collect and determine whose right it is. if you were advising the FIRS, I mean, you're a lawyer, would you advise them to go on appeal? Would they have a leg to stand on in your assessment?
In my view, I've read the judgment, I think they probably will lose the case. But again, this is a case where there could be political settlement. For example, the FIRS is a collecting agency, federal this time. Now, the Finance Act 2020 does not necessarily preclude FIRS collecting for the state. So you could say, for example, if you're going to collect VAT in River State, could you work out an arrangement where FIRS still does the collection so you don't create double regime for corporate entities?
But the money is remitted to the state.
And then probably the states pay FIRS. So
right.
Now, what these other less advantaged states will get is that payment, that service charge that the River State pays to FIRS for collection, which is now shares to states that unfortunately at this point in time have no option in generating VAT. So we can have a mixture where we concede that states ought to be the ones collecting this tax, but we have a federal bureaucracy that's well established with the science, with the knowledge, with democratic power to do the job very well.
Right.
Then maybe out of 100, you take 30, Rivers or Lagos or whether or Kaduna cannot take 70, and that pulling of that 30 will not constitute compensation for the short term for those states that need to ramp up their capacity to generate wealth.
But given the way that this is moving, you made some very interesting points and you expanded on the issue. I mean, does it seem as if this is going to encompass areas like restructuring, for example?
Yeah, it will. You know, there are three ways I've argued that we can restructure. One is constitutional part, clear. You go to the National Assembly, but of course there's a filibuster. There's also Trump, a veto, depending on geopolitics. But the other is what we call administrative restructuring, which many people have argued. Governance, in the Tinubu era as governor of Lagos State, there's several litigation against government, federal government, and then they won some of them. So you could look at interstices in the law, open gaps, and govern and get to restructure. But also what we call in policy executive avoidance of law.
Right.
So you probably play dead brain to the law and do what ought to be done. It has come to the point where restructuring has become an imperative, such that we're going to see more of this, more of state governors, challenging the federal government or usurping territories or doing things that in the past, we've considered the federal government.
So it's coming to a head.
Absolutely, there'll be a head up, and we need to do something to.
Dr. Sam Amadi, always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much indeed.